Many years ago, I found myself standing in a line a few feet from the rear hatch of a military aircraft, a Dakota. Suddenly, a bulkhead light turned from red to green and the line shuffled forward, and then to my horror, I found myself standing a few inches from the hatch, looking down to the cows in a field some 2,000 feet below. I'd never been so frightened. Thinking desperately, why on earth am I doing this? I jumped. The second I jumped, all fear fell away, if you can excuse the pun. For I had things to do. Count 3,000s, check that my parachute lines had not become twisted, check that my chute had in fact deployed, and then, for a brief moment, admire the view and take in an exhilarating descent. I'd been well trained and drilled, and whilst I hadn't packed my parachute, I had faith in those who had. Faith and fear, as it were. Well, in our two readings today, we have two very understandable examples of fear. Elijah. He's recently bested and killed the prophets of Baal in the great contest on Mount Carmel. He's been informed that Jezebel is going to have him killed, and he is now persecuted by those whom he had sought to counsel. He's been beset with thoughts of suicide and has just fled for his life across an unforgiving desert. He's now climbed a mountain and rests in his cave. His fear, though, will continue, for God speaks to him twice, and twice asks, "What are you doing here?" And in his fear and demoralization, he defends himself and bemoans his fate. And then he still has to endure mountain-splitting winds, earthquakes and fire, and then sudden silence. And what a silence! A silence that allows him to hear a gentle voice, the daughter of a sound, as one translation puts it. And in that quiet voice, God simply indicates that all will be well, gives him instructions, and sends him on his way. And the disciples. John the Baptist has been barbarically killed on the orders of Herod, and Jesus and the disciples have retreated to a quiet, safe place. But to their probable consternation, they are followed by thousands who, in seeking contact with Jesus, will inevitably attract the attention of Herod. And to make matters worse, their rabbi insists on performing a miracle and feeds them all, something that would definitely attract Herod's attention. Then their rabbi goes off by himself up a mountain, and they're stuck in a boat in the middle of the sea in very high winds. And then to top everything off, they're assailed by what they believe to be a ghost, which turns out to be Jesus. And as for Elijah, there is sudden silence as the wind stops the moment Jesus and Peter enter the boat. Before that, however, something remarkable has happened. Peter jumped off the boat, walked on the water, emulating Jesus. Although the text does make the distinction that whilst Peter walked on water, Jesus walked on the sea. And if we think about it, he's walked on water twice, once out and once back with Jesus. For there's nothing in Scripture to say that he was carried. Now, if some have done, you can engage in intensive study on the possibility of humans being able to walk on water. And whilst there are over 12,000 species on Earth, that can, humans, it appears, are not one of them. There are some ancient Eastern texts that indicate certain spiritual masters were able to do such things, but most would agree that it's something that really just doesn't happen. You could also postulate on other theories ranging from ice to sandbanks, or you can ignore all that and just believe. Have faith in the Scriptures, which unfortunately leaves us Christians a little vulnerable, doesn't it? Some of us, however, will believe that the events we call miracles did literally happen, and some will say that it's all just a story to illustrate a higher meaning. It's a problem that really has always been with the church. Some 1700 years ago, Origen of Alexandria taught a way of approaching Scripture. He suggested that the stories in Scripture have various layers of meaning. The first layer, or the surface layer, is often just that, a story. Nuanced stories, however, that touch those who don't know how the texts function. Stories that build faith, give guidance, and stories that give hope and comfort and peace to those who embrace them. He also taught that there are other layers of meaning waiting to be revealed. These layers required a method suitable to exploring text that is filled with symbols, filled with myth and allegory. Unfortunately, those layers were often only accessible to the educated, the clergy, the hierarchy. And then, of course, as time progressed and the hierarchy devoted more of their energy to maintaining the hierarchy, the skills and knowledge of how to explore a text full of that symbolism and allegory atrophied and often disappeared. For some today, it's enough to take Scripture literally and to just live in that knowledge. Others who struggle to make sense of what is written draw comfort from the tools now available to explore and understand Scripture at different levels. But before we get too smug, we need to remember that, as a current theologian puts it, when it comes to reading Scripture, the important thing to remember is not that those ancient people told literal stories and we're now smart enough to take them symbolically, but they told them symbolically, and that we're now dumb enough to take them literally. Now, that might be a little harsh, but it does remind us that reading Scripture is hard work. We may well have forgotten more than we once knew of Scripture, but it just makes it all the more compelling that we discover meaning in Scripture that speaks to our current situations. And don't we have enough situations going on in the world to fully occupy us as we seek to reveal other ways of being in the world, other ways to understand what it is to be human and what it is to be divine? The other day, I was in the company of a man who was in pain, emotionally, physically, and I imagine spiritually. He had a history of illness, both physical and mental, and had just recently been released from prison. He was desperately in need of the 11 drugs that had been prescribed, and he was lonely, angry, and bewildered. His need was compelling, and yet we knew that he could be extremely dangerous and had threatened to kill 2 workers of another agencies and had required numerous security guards to restrain him when he'd entered ED the night before. Yet despite this, the staff fed him, clothed him, obtained his meds, and found him accommodation. What was it that enabled the staff to give that assistance in a particularly dangerous and fearful context? What is it that compels in anyone such a response in real and present danger? I posit that it's a mix of courage, compassion, anger at injustice, all combining to ignite what I interpret as that spark of the divine inherent in us all, the spark that enables each human being to respond in love despite the circumstances. And I suspect that spark exists in all humans, irrespective of creed or dogma. I also acknowledge that often that spark is suppressed and almost extinguished. But it's that spark that Peter exhibited, not whilst he was walking on the water, but rather when he jumped over the side of the boat. The moment when he did show faith, did show courage, did recognize Jesus in his true nature, and did what no faithless person would do, jump off the boat. It's the jumping that counted. Sure, he began to sink, but only when he became frightened, an all too human response. It's that same spark of the divine that ignited the response by the workers the other day, a spark that, despite the very real danger, gave them courage to reach out their hand to offer assistance. No lecture on the need for self-control, no engagement around the matters of alcohol and drugs, just a hand. In the same way that Jesus immediately reached out and caught Peter when he stumbled. Jesus did, of course, then address Peter in a very human way. "Oh, you of little faith, why do you doubt?" And that's the thing I like about Jesus, that he was fully human. And that's the thing I like about us, that we all have a spark of the divine. Amen.